So this is probably more of a fancy setup than you will need. You know, your notes there basically describe it working up from just like your phone and a couple of hardware store clamp lights with like a 150 watt bulb, or the biggest bulb you can put in there without it catching on fire. Working here, though, using our equipment, we have 3 flavors of lighting that you can borrow whenever you want. Tungsten, LED, and those are both ambient continuous light sources, or electronic flash, otherwise known as strobe. So I'll talk about the why you would use one or the other. Tungsten lights are going to be much more intuitive because it's just you turn on the light and the light is on. Plug it into the outlet, turn it on, try not to touch it when it's on because it's hot. That's why they're called hot lights. LED is a little different, a little more complicated. Burns much, much cooler. It's much less light output, but for a lot of stuff, you don't need tons and tons of light. LEDs are super flexible. They're a little more affordable than you know, fancy pants strobes, and they have some features I'll talk about that make them attractive. So if you're thinking about buying lights for yourself, LED is probably the direction to go, unless you're photographing very large things, like entire installations. And that's why we'll talk about the strobes. So, but the principles, especially of 2D lighting design setup, transfer. It's clamp store hot lights to, you know, $10,000 strobe system, exact same physics in terms of the light and the camera and all that. So that's what I'm going to mostly focus on, is the setup. So you got some rules there on your cheat sheet. One is start building the set from the largest thing you have to photograph that day. I guess an unwritten rule is photograph everything in one day, rather than building a set, striking it, building a set, striking it. You introduce variables in the lighting, very likely if you do that. So gather up all your stuff, all your flat stuff, and start building your set based on the largest thing you have. And that's going to determine where you can do it. It's probably going to be in there for the most part, or in 223. Not in your space, necessarily, not in your studio. Because main rule is the lights can't be closer to the work than twice the width of the largest thing you're photographing. I think I say it more elegantly in the notes. So the way this goes is, biggest thing you have, measure the width, 54 inches. So 108 inches is as close as I can get. Look at that! 108. With the light. I can get further away if the room allows it, but I can't get any closer. Can't get any closer than twice the width. And that's a forever kind of rule. The other forever kind of rule is the lights have to be at a 45-degree angle. In some cases, they can be at a more extreme angle than 45, but it can't be less than 45 degrees. So the way I did this, and you probably can't see it, definitely can't see it on the video, is I just took some string and made a square, you know, like you could set a box on the ground, you turn it to 45 degrees, and then just run some tape or some string. And that shows you basically the axis that the light has to be on. And if it moves in and out, it moves along that track, along that 45-degree axis. If you want to be really uptight and anal, like I tend to be, you can take a string and run it perfectly square from the wall, straight out to the camera. That's the track or the axis that the lens has to be on. So say I have a push pan right in the center of the work on the floor. Maybe lights would help. Woo, look at that. So there's my 45-degree angle. If I wanted to, I could run another string or another piece of tape straight out, perpendicular, and that would be right where the lens goes. Can't go that way, can't go that way. It has to be on that track. The other thing you got to lock in is you build the set from where you want to stand or sit Maybe you want to roll around on a chair while you do it. But basically what I do is I first set up the camera and I put it where my eye's going to be comfortably, framing up, so I'm not doing this or this. And then start building the set from that. Right? So the center of the work is right where the lens is, or at least right where I want it to be. Again, biggest thing I have today is this print. Then, to get the lights at the exact same height as the camera, it's a lot easier if you move the light to the camera. Otherwise, you're across the room kind of trying to eyeball it. Is it at the same height or not? Just put it right next to the camera. Same with the other one. Are they at the same height? Yes, I think they are. And then back to your 45-degree spot. I'm going kind of fast. Do you have questions yet? Just because we're making a video, you can interrupt me as we go. And just freeform. Okay, so I got my distance, got my angle. Camera's where it has to be. So I'm going to work on locking in the lights, and then I'll talk more about why you work from the largest thing down to the smallest thing. So I'm going to go over the LED lights, and then after I make a couple of pictures, switch over to the tungsten and talk about those. They're simpler. LEDs are slightly more complicated, but more better, for sure. One of the complications we have in here is mixed ambient lighting in the room. We've got a skylight dropping daylight down, so no lights at all on in here except those sodium vapors. Pretend they don't exist. It's a totally different thing. Mostly what this is lit with is daylight, which is 5,000, 5,500 degrees Kelvin, give or take. Why does that matter? Color temperature matters to cameras. Doesn't matter to you because your brain just kind of smooths it out. You're not seeing that those are green and that light's yellow and that light's blue. If you were seeing that constantly, you'd probably just have an aneurysm. Your brain is just kind of smoothing it all out. And you see the colors kind of the way they look. Camera doesn't do that though. Camera sees one color temperature at a time. So we want to light the set according to whatever pollution we're getting. So right now we're getting a lot of daylight pollution, color pollution. So we need daylight lights. Luckily with LED, you can dial in the color temperature. Tungsten, you can't do that. So with tungsten, you would want to wait till it's dark. Right? If you're shooting with tungsten, which is 3,200 degrees Kelvin, much lower color temperature, visually warmer, meaning more yellow. Strobe is fixed at daylight, 5,500 degrees Kelvin, unless you filter it, put something over it. Tungsten unfiltered is 32. So blue, yellow. These can be dialed in, which is super cool. I'm going to fire this up. And there's a little readout on the back that you'll never be able to see from back there, but I'm just going to explain it. First, there's some buttons, and you see they run from blue to red, and they have little numbers on them. And it says 55, the bifocals are kind of freaking out. 5,800, 5,000, 4,000, 3,200. So 3,200 is full-on tungsten. It's not letting me change it. There. I'll turn this one off so you can really see. So, kind of a yellow light, right? That's blue though. It doesn't look blue, but it is because it's daylight, I promise. So we're going to change this over to daylight. That one's also set for 5,000 or 5,500. So then as you got 45-degree angles, twice the width of the work away, and now we're going to position or angle the light itself. So I've got these, turn this off. These are called barn doors, and they're just for kind of cutting the light, modulating the throw. Right now I've got them wide open because I want to see what I'm actually getting here on this print. generally, once the lights are set at their 45-degree angle, I try to illuminate the left side of the work with the right light for the most part. So I don't point it straight at the center, I kind of point it like that and favor the left side and then lock that down. And then turn that one off and do one at a time so you can actually see what you're doing. And I'm going to kind of favor the right side. See that? With the left light. Then when I turn both on, I'm always the one that trips over the cords. Just so you know, it's going to be me for sure. I'm still going to fire the assistant, but it's going to be me and my fault completely. Okay, then to prove to myself that it's perfect, even illumination across the whole print, I'm going to take meter readings all around. You can do that with your camera by painstakingly taking it off the tripod and walking all the way over to the work and pointing the lens at a gray card. You guys know what a gray card is? Did I not bring a gray card? Probably didn't. Here's a fake one. A gray card is a gray card. Kodak makes them. They're like $10 and they're coated. This one is one that I printed, just so I would always have one on the card. This is 50%, halfway between black and white. Or photographers call it 18% gray, because it's 18% reflectance. That's what these think they're looking at, light meters. The light meter in your camera or an ambient meter, handheld meter, they're calibrated to average to 18% reflectance. So when you're photographing artwork, you either need, it's not both, one or the other, a handheld ambient meter or flash meter, or a gray card in your camera. Now with digital, you can just kind of take a bunch of pictures and pick the one that looks right. But to get a really accurate meter reading, you need a gray card. You got to point your lens at the gray card. And the way you use it is go to where the work is, and then without casting a shadow with your head, it's a little tricky, get in there and fill the frame with gray. It doesn't matter if it's focused. Don't bother focusing. Just fill the frame with gray. And then with the camera set for fully manual, get it so the exposure is perfect. Now, without getting all techie about that, the variables there are the sensitivity, whether you're shooting film or digital, sensitivity, shutter speed, and the aperture, right? So I have sensitivity set to 100 ISO right now for this on this camera. So I could either grab the camera, walk all the way over, take a meter reading from the gray card, dial the aperture up and down until it says perfect, good to go, and then forget the exposure, all right? That's the base exposure. Because when you pull the camera back and put it back on the tripod and remove the gray card, it's going to give you a different reading. Especially if you have a lot of wall space around it. If you're intentionally photographing it to look like an installation, to look like a painting in a gallery, for example, all that white is going to lie to the meter. So you want a meter from the gray card, then back and lock it in. I even sometimes put a piece of artist tape across the back of the camera with the exposure and write it in Sharpie. And that way, when it tells me that there's way too much light, I know that's not true. It's just reflecting more now. So it's either gray card or one of these, which we have. And if you decide this is easier for reasons other than just me telling you that it is, then you would check one of these out when you check out the other stuff. So with an incident meter, you're measuring not the light that's reflected off of the work into the lens, you're measuring the light that's falling on the subject. So you go to the subject and take a reading. And it's set for ambient, it's set for 100 ISO. The shutter speed is a 60th of a second. Tells me f2.0, which I probably don't have on this lens. Nope. So that means I got to slow down. Or increase the sensitivity. Are you following me with all this camera talk? It's telling me there's not enough light for the lens I have. So the things I can do, I can slow the shutter speed down and allow more light to come in, or what I prefer to do is increase the sensitivity. Take the ISO up. Can't do that on your phone, right? With your phone, you just have to like deal with it. So, is this on? I'm going to take the ISO to 320. ISO. 320. Take another meter read. 2.8 I do have on that lens. So, set that for 2.8. And then I'm going to meter all the way around and make sure that it is within. And this is kind of another uptight film thing. With digital, it's not quite so critical because you can make some adjustments. But for the most part, you want to be within a half an f-stop all the way around. Right? So the center is probably going to be the brightest part. It's going to get a little darker as you move out here with these lights. If it is darker by more than half a stop, it'll look darker in the image that you make. So you don't want it to be off by more than half a stop. So I'm going to meter here, 2.8. Casting a shadow marker. Come out here, and notice how I'm kind of pointing at this little dome back at the lens. You don't just put it flat. Pretend that the meter is attached to the lens with a string. You actually want to angle it towards the lens. If your wrist doesn't bend, then you can do this. But otherwise, just point at the lens. 2.8. 2.8. 2.8. 2.8. I'm a genius. It's official. Okay, now we make an exposure. So in terms, okay, and right now the camera is telling me it's way too bright. But it's not. Unless the meter's wrong. The way I frame this up is to look like an object on a wall. Right? I'm not just going to make, I have this file, so I don't really necessarily need to make a perfect cropped reproduction of the print. I want to make a photograph of the object. And I might even want some scale reference. So I'm all the way out to here. I've got a fair amount of safety. Obviously I can crop it in Photoshop if I need to, but I kind of want to see the push pins for this image. And I might even, if I want to be all fancy, drop in a color reference like a color chart. Then it looks like you're in our forum. The other cliche is the painting on the paint cans. Right? That way you know it's paint. Okay. So again, this is probably way fancier than is necessary for your purposes, but what I like to do when I can is tether the camera to my laptop. So I'm just capturing directly. I can see very clearly if it's perfect or not. Instead of having to squint at the little LCD on the back. And it's not. So that meter's a little off, which is no big deal. It's a SUNY meter. It happens. So that looks like it's about 2 stops too bright. I'm going to take it down and see what happens with another exposure 2 stops darker. Too dark. There we go. That's perfect-ish, right? Okay, so those are the rules. Camera square, centered, right? And you don't pan the camera, right? If you need to adjust back and forth, you unfortunately have to drag the tripod back and forth. If you need to adjust fore and aft, don't zoom. I'll talk about lenses in a second. Resist the temptation to zoom. Just move the tripod back and forth. Again, if you need to go up or down, don't tilt the camera up or down. The camera stays locked at level, and the tripod raises up or down. So lenses. With a DSLR or 35mm film camera, you don't want to photograph works of art with a lens shorter than 50 millimeters. If you don't have a 50mm lens, borrow one from us. Borrow a camera and a lens. This is a 55mm micro, which is specifically for copy work. It has a very, very flat field of view. And it'll also focus real close, like that far away from objects. We have these that you can borrow. We got like 2 or 3 of these micro Nikon lenses. If you have just the regular old lens that came with your camera and it's a zoom lens, zoom it out to between 50 and 70 or so millimeters in focal length. Since we're doing this on video, I'll say why. It doesn't really matter why, just do what I say. but the reason you do that is that the wider the angle of view, or the shorter the focal length of the lens, the more you distort the shape of the thing. So the closer the center will appear to be and the further away the corners will be. So for a really large painting, that's going to be a drag. You're going to have to do a lot of correcting in Photoshop, which at least you can do that correcting in Photoshop, but you save a ton of time if you just start with a 50mm lens or longer, right? Which means you're going to need a bigger space, probably. So if you don't have enough space, your back is against the wall, and you have to cheat and zoom it out, you can break that rule and get into, you know, the dangerous territory of upwards, you know, towards like 35 millimeters. But just watch the shape of the thing. If you're looking through the viewfinder and you have, hopefully you can turn on the grid. Most cameras you can turn on the grid in your viewfinder. Just watch the corners. They'll start to go, and it'll start to bend. If you're off axis at all, that's when you'll see it. You'll see, well, why does one side look longer than the other? You just look at the tripod, it's because you're turned slightly, right? So 50 to 70 millimeter lens, if you can. If you can't, borrow it from us. And camera's on a track, doesn't move. So we got our image of the big thing that we have for the day. So now I'm going to swap out and Sarah's going to go get a tiny little painting. And we'll talk about why you don't move the lights at all. So this is the set for anything this size and smaller. If this were something that had a lot of depth, it's only that deep, so I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to get the wall and the piece in focus. If it was very deep, I would want a smaller aperture, higher f number, smaller aperture. The reason being you get more depth of field, more in focus at a smaller aperture, the whole. Right? So somewhere around f16, f22, this lens goes up to f32, would give more description from foreground to background. But again, at 1 inch, 1.5 inches of depth, I'm not too worried about it. What I need is more light. So I'm going to slow the shutter speed down to let more light in. So right now I'm at, what, 100. I'm going to slow down to 30. Let's see what that does. It's more better, but not perfect. And then a little more. 15th. So at a 15th of a second, you absolutely need a cable release. You need a tripod anyway, just to make your life easier in general, but to hold the camera steady and to not introduce vibrations from your jittery hand and your heart pumping and everything, then you want to have something that isolates the movement from your hand. And that's what this is. Yeah, I can make that perfect. So it's a decent exposure. I can see everything. I can see the shadows. I know that I can go into Photoshop and I can turn up the blacks and I can clean up the whites and I can, you know, do my thing, which we'll talk about a little bit. So that's your 2D lighting setup. Now I'll complicate it by talking about hot lights. They put out more light than LEDs, so that's really, they're simpler and they put out more light. So those are, I guess, the reasons to use hot lights over these. These are great for really small things, and they're great for something like if you have to leave the lights on for a really long time, because they generate almost no heat. Some. Not really any. You know, put my hand right on it, it's not hot. These are awesome for video. You don't need a ton of light usually for video, so these are great for video. Still photography, sometimes you need more light, and that's when you would switch over to the hot lights. So this setup is mostly for making flat things more flat, right? Drawings, photographs. This is for getting even illumination across the whole surface of the thing. If you have something shiny in one part and dull in another, or if you have depth and the painting contains shadows, then you probably need to diffuse to turn down the volume on the shadows, right? Because now you're inching closer to the realm of 3D. So where there are fewer rules, they're just more complicated for photographing three-dimensional objects. But you know, something with a lot of surface depth is starting to get into the realm of 3D. So you have to use some of those techniques. One would be having one light source and one reflector. So you have a key light and a fill, or one light that's brighter than the other, or diffusion on both lights. And there are tricks, and it's more like what you see is what you get. So you try a thing and you make an exposure, and you know, now we're in the age of seeing it right away. So you can look on the screen and go, nope, that wasn't it. And you try another thing, nope, that wasn't it either. So then you try the next thing. But in your sort of toolkit of things to try, it's start by simplifying. So if the problem is glare, reflections, deep shadows, keep the setup you have and try diffusing the light. If that still doesn't do it, consider changing the setup. Turn one light up and one light down. Use reflected light rather than diffused light, which I'll show you with the strobes in a second here. Use a key light and a fill card to bounce light back into the work. I mean, it's like a negotiation. I mean, it's what you see is what you get. Okay, these are the hot lights. And this is the kit you would take out if you needed more light than LED affords, but you're not ready to go with strobes. So, looks kind of like the lights I just took off, but it's a very different bulb and a very different light source. And this is, you can see from this dial, a focusable Fresnel lens on the front of the light, which means it can be, if you turn it down this way, a spotlight. It can be, if you turn it up this way, a floodlight. So, spot, flood. And you'll see when we set them up why you would want one or the other. These also have cute little, precious little barn doors. So a lot of the stuff that you figure out with the LED lights will transfer directly over to the hot lights. This attaches one way or another. Clamps on like a so. Even though we're not going to use these. These have stands, and umbrellas, and extension cords, spare bulbs. You might be wondering what that's for. That's for changing the bulb. You can't touch these bulbs with your hands because the oil from your skin will create a focus point, a hot spot on the bulb, and then when you turn it on, it'll explode. And then you'll have to change the bulb again, and then it'll explode again. And so when you're changing out the bulb, it's burnt bulb, wait till it cools off, take it out, and then fresh bulb, glove up, and install it with the glove. Or your shirt, or whatever. But, got a lifetime supply of bulbs now. Okay, so these are like the officially approved extension cords. And when possible with these lights, it's good to separate them into individually breakered outlets. That may not be a luxury you can afford, like in your apartment. Probably your whole apartment's on one breaker. But here, they're probably separately breaking. So if there's one on one side of the room and one on the other side, do that. We have more. We have a lot of these. So this is what they call a white umbrella, right? It can be used for diffusion, so you can shine the light through it, and there's a little mounting. Woo! It's going to be hot. Never do this. There's a little mounting screw here. But somewhat again screwed all the way in. Into which the umbrella goes. And when it gets to that little springy thing, stop. Don't push that in and keep pushing the umbrella, because that's keeping you from getting it too close so that it doesn't burn up. Right? This is heat resistant, not heat proof. It will catch on fire eventually if you get too close to it. So, like that, we're shining through the umbrella and it's diffused. One thing to note, it doesn't matter in this case because the light is plenty far away. But this now becomes the light source in terms of distance. So if you have, if you're using like a diffusion screen, it's like 2 feet in front of the light, that's the light source, the diffusion panel. So you have to take that into account with the twice the width of the work thing. And you might have to push your set out. You follow? Light's back here, but this is now closer, significantly. Again, tiny little thing, so it doesn't matter. So that's one way to modulate the light. The other is to use this as a reflector, which means we turn the light around like that. This is for covering a much larger area. This poor little thing is sagging. So now light's shining away from the painting, and the reflector is bouncing it back. So that's going to cover a much larger area. Super effective with the strobes, which we're going to talk about in a second. I have another kind of umbrella here that is only for reflecting, and it's a shinier surface inside, and it's black so that it doesn't shine through. So obviously this wouldn't be super effective as diffusion. It's only used as a reflector. So first I'm going to take a reading, several meter readings for an ambient exposure just with these lights. These are also hot lights. Right? If you don't know what kind of lights they are in the space, you probably want to ask. Museum now has LED, I believe, right? Catherine, does the museum have LED light?
I actually don't know. I can find out that.
I think they got new lights, and I believe they're LEDs. So Jeffrey would have to tell you what the color temperature is. A meter that reads color temperature is more fancy than you will ever be able to afford. We don't have them. Color meters are real expensive. But just ask. And you've got a digital camera that you can set the white balance for almost anything. As long as it's just one thing. Right? You can't set a white balance that covers more than one color temperature. But you can bet that these are old halogen lights. Also, they dim. That's another clue that they're hot lights. They're on a rheostat, you can dim them. So they are at their coldest, meaning their bluest, 3200. As they dim, they get warmer, 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 visually warmer. Lower color temperature, visually warmer. So if we dim them down, it gets more and more yellow. Right? You can almost perceive that it gets warmer. And the brighter they get, the colder they get. I guess that's crimped all the way up.
What about like this kind of like these like
The hot spots?
Yeah.
That's what we get with ambient lighting. So that's why we're going to now illuminate with strobe. So what Hannah asked is about these hot spots on the wall, which are there. And like I said, your brain is kind of smoothing those out and you're focused on the paintings. But if you squint, like, yep, there are hot spots above every painting, not just the ambient lighting. So Now we're going to do the kind of time-consuming conversation about lighting this with electronic flash with umbrellas. Two big umbrellas and two very, very, very bright lights. That's the pack. This is the head. This is the reflector. This part is the flash tube. That is the flash tube. That bulb right there is a model light. That's a 500 to 1,000 watt, what does it say? Bifocals, do your thing. 1,000 watt tungsten bulb. So you could just shoot photographs with these, because there's a hot light in the middle. But the point of the model light is to show you what the flash is going to give you. So it's cleverly, positioned inside the tube. The flash tube is what puts out the daylight in a short burst. The 1,000 watt bulb inside is just so you can even see what it's going to do. Because like I said, you can't see that flash. You just see a flash of light. You can't see the shadows and the highlights and is it a good exposure. That's math. Math will let you see that through the camera. Right? Again, don't touch any of that with your hand, but especially the model light. The flash tube is not such a big deal, but the model light you can't touch with your hand. This is a little bayonet mount. Like that. Connector goes into strobe pack, and it only goes one way, so turn it around until it feels right, and then click, and then it's locked, so that you can't accidentally unplug it. There's a really, really, really good reason for that. If this is on and up to full power, and you unplug it, it shocks you. Real good. And if you have one hand on the pack, and the other hand on this, you make a complete circuit. So it not only shocks you, it goes through your heart. Just super extra bad. So don't do that. If you're working with the pack and you're afraid of doing that, put a hand in your pocket so that you're only using one hand. But you're not going to do that. You're not going to unplug it while it's on, at the full power, because that would be bad. So we plug both strobe heads into the pack and fire. Okay, now we got to do fancy metering because we have to change the meter over to flash. It was set for ambient, which is just normal, the light that's happening, right? In order to meter for the flash, you won't be able to use your camera meter. You have to use a flash meter. So when you check out the strobes, they come with a meter in the box. Set it for non-C. Non-C is for no cord attached. If you're flying solo, you're going to have to set it for cord. That means you take the PC cord that would otherwise connect to the camera and you connect it to the flash. So that when you go over here and hit the go button, it fires the flash. It actually makes that sound. What I'm going to do though is have somebody on the pack hitting the green button. And I'll make it Paul because he's not afraid. Yep, green button. That's the one. Okay, so I'm going to change over to the non-cord. I'm going to take my shutter speed way up to the 60th of a second. Okay, so I was at a half a second to get F16. Now let's see what we get out of this. Okay, anytime you're ready. F11.5 at a 60th of a second. So I would prefer more power than that. Unfortunately, that's up as high as it goes currently. So I would need a bigger pack. Smaller room or bigger pack. Which we have, but not here. So for the demonstration, I'm just going to shoot it at 11.5 at a 60th of a second. And we're going to turn the gallery lights back on. They're not going to give any, well actually don't turn on yet, Kevin. I want to prove that they're not going to give us any additional illumination. They're really not going to light up the wall, but in the shot, they'll look like they're on. Right? So it's a little bit of It's actually like all of photography. It's a lie. It's a total lie. Now, in order to synchronize the camera with the pack, I have to physically connect it. We have in this box a fancy infrared slave system. And I mean, I geek out on fancy stuff. I never use that shit. I never use the infrared slave. An actual solid wire connected to the camera, connected to the pack, is very unlikely to fail. So that's what I do. So you're going to have a PC connection on your camera. And if you don't, then I'm sure Canon or Nikon will sell you an adapter for like $50. It will allow you to plug it in just like this. If you paid more than $1,000 for your camera, you already have one. It's just right there on the side of the camera. These packs, Speedotron made a modification that I very much approve of in the last few years. They changed the connector that goes into the pack to a phono cord, a 1/4-inch phono cord plug. It used to just be a standard 2-prong outlet. You can probably guess why that's a terrible idea. If you're moving fast and you're plugging things in and you see the 2-prong electrical outlet, you're likely possibly to plug that into the wall. And then when you hit the shutter, you open a connection from the wall to your camera. And it doesn't hurt you, but it destroys your camera. Like that, new camera time. So I guess enough people did that they switched over to this. So the worst thing that could happen is you can plug this into, I don't know, an amp, and nothing will happen. Because that's what it is, it's like a 1/4-inch plug. Okay, now we're synced up so that when I press the shutter there, strobes fire. Every camera has a preferred sync shutter speed. And on a manual camera, it's usually indicated by a lightning bolt. And what that says is, this is the speed at which you want to sync the flash, or slower. Slower is fine. Faster is not fine. Anything above that sync speed, you're not going to get a full image. And my laptop went to sleep. What did I say? 60th at 11 and a half.
11
right?
and a half, yeah.
Too bright. So, too much light. It's a good thing. Having too much light is a good thing. Because I actually wanted to shoot at f/16 anyway. Still too bright. Let's try. That's better. Okay, so perfect, even illumination, 0 hotspots. Now I turn on the gallery lights. And take an ambient reading at a 60th of a second. 2.8. Remember how many stops away that is from f/16? It's 5 stops away. That's not going to have any effect on the way the image looks. 5 stops is like, if you fucked up by 5 f-stops, you would have a very, very, very dark or very, very, very light image, and you would have no description of anything. So 5 stops away is like safe. You know, it's not going to be a problem. But they will look like they're on for the part of the frame that shows the ceiling. Right? That's the only reason to have them on. See? Exact same photograph, but the lights look like they're on. Model light goes on. Power is still on. Very important to note. The light is on and it's green. The lights don't appear to be on, but the pack is live, right? So we don't unplug anything. I mean, you can unplug a sync cord. But even then, there's a real good chance that as you're pulling that out,
you're going to clip the sides and it's going to trip. And then you'll be like, oh my God! Because I made you scared. So, you know, see if I can get it to work. No, it doesn't want to. Happens almost every time I plug it into the camera, though. You know, it trips it. So don't panic if that happens. Okay, so let's say, for example, all right, here's what I want to do. I want to take the power to that down. I've, for whatever reason, decided that I want more light on this area and less light here, and I want to trim the power on that. If I wanted to do that by moving the light around, that changes the way the thing looks. And what I told you about, the closer the light source is, the lower the contrast. If I like the contrast, and I don't want to move stuff around, I just want less coming out of that, then I can do that here. And the way I would do it is, I go to this button that says ratio, and I would take, basically we have 4 circuits here. There's really only 3, but there's 4 places that these can plug in. So I'm going to isolate that one by switching the ratio down, where that is now 1 circuit, and the other 2 circuits are going to that light. So that's going to be half the power of that one light. But I haven't cycled the pack, so nothing has really changed. So what I need to do is pop the flash one time, and now the change is there. Now that is at half of that power. If I needed to unplug that and move it to another plug to get to a different circuit, again to adjust the power, pay close attention. Power to the entire unit goes off and it flashes. Reason it flashes is called fast bleed. That's another improvement Speedotron made a couple of decades ago, I guess. That dumps the charge in the pack. Older units don't do that. Older units, you turn it off and it's still here. And if you unplug it, then you will know that it's still there. So it doesn't hurt anything to hit that flash button, right? Just to prove to yourself that it's not on. Before you go to unplug it, just, nope, nothing. There, now I can unplug it. And everything's fine. And yeah, I use both hands. One to hold the pack, because I was pretty sure there was nothing there that was going to hurt me. Have you ever been shocked? Yeah, so Paul's done this 30 years, never been shocked. You're not going to get shocked. The only time I ever got shocked is when someone was yelling at me and confusing me and talking to me in f-stops, and I'm having to translate to watt seconds, and I got confused. And I... Yeah. But, again, I don't plug or unplug with the power on. So I turn the power off to unplug it, power stays off to plug it back in. And then if you want to just prove to yourself that it's really in, just try to unplug it. If you can't, then you can power back up. Beep.
That was perfect. Your beep, that was great.
I always turn that off. I don't like listening to the beep. I'd rather just look at it. So there's a little beep, on or off, right next to the fast recycle or not. If the circuit, the breaker trips internally in the pack, you can reset it, but you might want to assess before you do that why it tripped, by maybe changing the outlet that it's plugged into. Like if you can't figure out how to get it on, this thing could be popped up, this little 15 amp breaker. If that pops out, switch outlets because there's something up with the power at the wall. It's probably not the pack. Like I said, these are only a few years old, so they're pretty stable. And it's not a lot of power. It's only 1,000 watt seconds. What else? That fast bleed is a nice thing. It keeps you aware. I have a very old unit and it doesn't do that. Okay. So this thing is a little mini softbox. That thing is a bike lock. That's there because I can't find the counterweight. Which is actually pretty good. Remember, I predicted that we would open this stuff up and I discovered a lot of things missing. So far, that's the only thing that's missing, is the sandbag that connects to that. For this softbox, that sandbag was a lot of counterweight. The idea here is that we definitely want it to be balanced. So you loosen it and kind of keep an eye on it. If it does move up or down, you want it to move away from your set, not into it, right? So if it's going to, be at all out of balance, it should be rising, not dropping. Because there's a good chance that you care more about what you're photographing than you do this light, right? So it should not be falling into the set. So again, to return to that sort of simple principle, the closer the light source is to the object, the lower the contrast. This is going to be our key light that provides all of the, if there's any harshness like shadows, bright highlights and dark shadows, it's coming from this one because it's so far away. This is going to be to lower the contrast. So this softbox becomes kind of effectively the fill light. Not really, but two flavors of light happening because we don't want to flatten this out, right? We're not going to do 45-degree angles, perfect, even, soft illumination. We actually want to describe the depth. So we want there to be shadows and we want there to be modeling, right? And differentiation. So, something like this. I'm making this up. I have no idea, really. I dragged this in here just because it exists, and you may decide that you want to use it at some point for additional fill. With three-dimensional stuff, I tend to say start simple and get complicated. So start with one light source and a reflector. That light source, again, that can be a clamp light from the hardware store and a sheet of foam for the reflector. Or it could be something fancy like a strobe and one of these, like, flexi, what do you call these things? I don't know what you call them. Foldy flexi reflector deals. Thank you, Paul. So when I'm bringing in a fill light, the reason I do that is to, as they say, open up the shadows. So if I make an exposure and I realize that no, the shadows here are way too dark. They're going to be like completely jet black with no surface detail at all. And the highlights are going to be blown out. So I want to reduce the contrast. So step one is a soft light really close to the subject, like that. Step two would be fill in those shadows with some reflectance. So if I have a really harsh shadow anywhere, I can bounce light from the other direction into the shadow, if you follow. You want to be catching the light from this light source in that reflector and bouncing some light back into the shadow areas. And if you don't get enough heat or action out of that side of it, flip it around to the very shiny side. So this side is white, this side is shiny. And if nothing else, the shiny side will show you, yeah, that's where the action is, right there. That's my sweet spot for this. But maybe that's too much, so now I can see it, and I flip it around to the white. And now we frame that up and see what it looks like. In fact, let's take the camera off the tripod. Another thing with strobe is that we don't have to worry one little bit about shutter speed. It's locked in at a 60. Bring it like I mean it. Trying to get in between Kathy's two panes, not on top of them. That's more better.
That's nice.
Yeah, so I'll show you how in Lightroom to fix that background without actually bringing in a third light, which is the correct way to do it. But the cheater way is to open up the shadows. Yeah, all right, that's that. That's everything you will ever need to know about photographing your stuff with our equipment. Yeah, I would, it's just like all the other stuff we have here. The physical space, the printers, the metal shop, the wood shop. Take as much advantage of it while you're here as possible, because all this shit costs money. When you're done and you're in the so-called real world that I've been told exists, I've never actually seen it. Use it while it's here. Use our cameras, use our strobes, use our tripods. Already imported, that's why it came up as develop, because they came in, they were imported as we did our tender capture. So let's start with the problem, the biggest problem, and then move on to the simple ones. And I apologize for the color, it's the screen. The screen is too dull yellow. And I ain't going to change my calibration on my laptop for that. So the first thing I want to do, a lot of the modern optics, Canon, Nikon, Zeiss, etc., have presets in Lightroom, which is super cool. Then I can come down here to remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections, and it sees the lens I used. And it automatically drops in some corrections. I can further correct more by coming down here to transform, and I'll turn on constrain crop. And let's see what happens if I click full transformation, which is full perspective control, and I just let Lightroom figure out what square it is. And it almost always gets it right. If it's a really radical distortion, you got to do it manually. But then you've got all these manual controls where you can do that. But often Lightroom's like, okay, lines in, art lands and be parallel, and floor is the floor, and the ceiling is the ceiling, and it just like fixes it. So it's a little funky, but I'm going to go with that's fine. The next setting I'm going to choose way up here at the top under these global exposure adjustments. I'm not going to change the exposure. On the monitor, it's much darker than, on the projection, it's a lot darker than it is on my monitor. My monitor, Hannah's object in the foreground is perfect. I've got surface description, I've got highlights, I've got shadows, soft, even, kind of perfect, three-dimensional illumination. It is shiny, so it should shine on the side here, right? I don't want to turn that down because it's actually a very, very glossy object. And we want to tell the truth about that. But I do want to possibly open up the shadows. So I'm going to grab the shadow slider here. And drag them up. And so I'm not going to mess up the highlights. I'm just going to open up these dark shadows back here. I can exaggerate that now by turning up the whites. And then if I start to lose detail, I can turn the blacks down. So I haven't really made radical transformations, and in fact on the projection it doesn't look like I did anything. But it did kind of take some of the dirtiness out of the shadows in the background. What would really solve that problem, like I said, is to have a third light illuminating the background. But at least this object is described. Let's go to this one. All right, again, before I start doing a bunch of manual perspective corrections, let's see what Lightroom does automatically. Starting with the lens. See if it can tell the lens I use. And it can. I use a Nikon AF 17 to 35 millimeter lens. And it automatically dropped in a little bit of correction. So here's probably a case I'm going to guess that if I choose constrain crop and hit full transformation for perspective control, it might just totally screw it up, but let's see what happens. It crops the painting on the right, but it mostly evened it up. And show you the difference, I'll go back. That's before. That's after. Wait, whoops, no it's not. That's before. That's after. So I guess the moral of the story here is reshoot it so that we don't crop that painting on the right out. But I do like the perspective control. Let's go to Sarah's painting. Remember, I turned this painting on its side just so I wouldn't have to tilt my camera. So the first thing we're going to have to do is turn it. I don't know which is the top and which is the bottom though. What do you think? Is it upside down?
Yeah, it's upside down.
Okay. So I kind of sort of like this. I don't like the shadow. I'm not wild about that. I can fix that in the lighting, obviously, if I was not trying to get everything done before 4 o'clock. We'll set it up and reshoot it. But again, not my work. I don't care. Tell me what lens I have, see if that helps. No, it doesn't. See, so here's a good example. I was using that ancient, it's probably 30-year-old 55 millimeter micro, and it has no idea what lens it's using. It doesn't register, which is fine. I'm going to turn on constraint crop. I'm going to hit full and square that up a little bit, and it ruined it. Right? So there's a good example of Lightroom is stupid. It has no idea what I want to do. In fact, I'm just going to leave it. If I go here and look at the grids, kind of fun. I might maybe bring the bottom, stretch the bottom out a little bit, which happens like this. Grab the vertical and go like that, like magic. I don't know, is that better?
Slightly less.
Too much? Take it down to 5. Oh, it's touchy with the trackpad. Okay, how's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you see what I'm doing? I'm just trying to square it up and I'm superimposing the grid lines so that I can tell if it's square or not. And these are the kind of things that most viewers aren't going to pick up on at all, but if you're going to bother making it perfect, right? It doesn't really take that long. The other thing I'm going to do before I get too out of control is I'm going to crop it. And I think I'm going to just choose an aspect ratio like 4:5, 8:10, and then center it. Forget about it. And that looks, I think, a lot better, just in terms of composition. And then I'm going to do that trick where I open up the shadows. So I'm going to take it too far and then go back, which is one of the nice things you can do with Lightroom. You can destroy it and then you just back up a little bit. So I'm going to open up the shadows all the way. And now I see what is too much. Right? I'm losing shadows in the actual object. So now I come back, come back, come back. I'm going to let that go right about halfway or so, a little less than halfway. Then I'm going to juice up the blacks a little bit. So you see the shadows don't get darker, but the blacks in the object do. And now I can, if I want to, brighten the highlights. And now that extra shadow is gone, completely gone. Well, not completely. I can see it a little bit. For the purposes of documentation, like for your work for 10 Week or for your work for a crit, you don't need to make it look like a product, right? You don't need to photograph it like you're photographing from a magazine. If it looks like it's an object on the wall, perfect, right? I mean, you just want a clear, good description of the thing, and you don't want to pretend that it's not a thing anymore. Seeing the texture of the wall in the case of Sarah's is awesome because then you know that it's really, really small. You actually see the roller texture of the wall. You can't see it, but I can. Those little, bonus features are really nice on the work. It's like really small and precious. And this is really well described, which is cool, because this is a level of description that is hard to get even standing in front of it. And you saw the page, it's, what is it, like 5 by 7
Yeah.
inches?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to focus this far away from it and see this in real life. And the goal should always be to make the photograph better than the actual level. Look at that. Not serious. This one I would crop to. There's maybe this is one of those tricks I want to show you in Photoshop, not in Lightroom. And that's actually something that I probably should show you. Because you've done all these things in Lightroom and you're super happy about it, but now what? Now it's still a raw file, and there's nothing, you don't have anything yet. You have to export it from Lightroom so that you have a TIFF or a Photoshop or a JPEG file that you can do something with. So I'm going to export all of them that I like. I'm going to do this one. I'm not going to do anything with this because I want to show you some controls in Photoshop, and I'll do them in Photoshop. So I'll just export this raw, and I'll grab this one, and installation view of Catherine's and Hannah's object. And go up to File, and choose Export, and then you have some choices to make. So right now it's set up to export JPEG, but not resize. I don't want a JPEG. I want a TIFF. I don't want to resize it. I don't want to make it smaller, and I don't want to make it bigger. I definitely don't want to make it bigger. Do you guys, you know about sizing images generally? Coming straight out of a 50 megapixel camera, which is what that Nikon is, it's plenty of file. I don't need to pretend that and make a larger file than that and be able to leave that the way it is. There are lots of reasons though to make it smaller. You can do that in Lightroom really easily. You can tell it, make it 3,000 pixels in the longest dimension, and export all these files to the JPEGs, 3,000 pixels in the longest dimension, and you're good to go for submitting and dropping into Mural or a critique or something. That's not going to help you if you want to make a print. If you want to make a large print of this, we don't. But pretend you do. Then you would export at the native size, and you would designate a file format other than JPEG, like TIFF. So that's what I do for this. And it's going to ask me where I want it to go. Where I want it to go is, I don't know. Let's put it on the desktop for now, so I don't have to make a decision. And that takes a little while because we have big files. So the next 44 files is going to take a few seconds. When I do a print workflow workshop, I'll separate out all the stuff that you need to know in terms of dealing with files that isn't just for print, like resizing for the web, resizing for residency applications and stuff like that. But in those cases, you tend to work backwards from what the requirements are for the application. So step one, go to NIFRA website. If you're applying for a NIFRA, what are they asking for, right? Aperture wants 3,000 pixels across, NIFRA wants 2,000, for example. So that's what we do, because I think the first level of rejections is people who didn't follow directions. With anybody, with any grant or residency or grad school or whatever, right? Did they even do what we asked them to do? No, that makes it easy. So find out first what they want and then do it. All I used to work in that. So you used to work in that, so you do all that. Alright, so I'm going to go to Photoshop and open those up. Lightroom, if you're wondering why Lightroom, why Photoshop, Lightroom is probably better for global changes and lots of the same changes to a bunch of files, and then exporting so that then it can be refined in Photoshop. Photoshop does basically everything Lightroom does, it's just in different places. And slightly more complicated, I think. So let's go to Photoshop files. Okay, this one, I'm gonna leave as is for now. Okay, I want to go to this one. I'm going to show you something that is kind of cool for color balance. So if, for example, you weren't totally sure, you don't have enough experience to look at this and know, well, is the color balance right? You can't tell. It looks a little yellow. One super cool trick you can do is leave that color checker in the frame. Notice I dropped that in on the lower right when I was making this photograph. The reason that's there is I can zoom in. Ooh, that's blurry. Goodness. Check my glasses. Oh my God, it's terrible. Good for the demo though. And if I go up to levels, image, adjustments, levels, I get this little histogram. Generally, in a histogram, which is just a map of the tones of the image, you don't, can you see from over there? Underneath that thing? You don't want empty space in a histogram. These little eyedroppers are the black point, white point, and midpoint. Remember, I held up that gray card and I said this is 18% reflectance, but it's also exactly halfway between black and white. If you click this eyedropper, then the next thing you click, you're saying this is exactly halfway between black and white. So if it's gray from a gray card, and it actually is exactly halfway between black and white, then you automatically, boom, set not only the exposure to like the ideal exposure, but the color. So you set the midpoint of that image at what is actually gray under the lighting situation. It's a cool little trick. And then you can adjust by closing the gap here and closing the gap here. And that's essentially what auto adjust does. If you just hit Shift Command L as set auto levels and just don't even look at it, that's kind of what it does. Is it just closes the gap. And then it looks a little bit better, right? So if you do that, then you can crop out. In fact, I don't want anything. I want nothing. Clear. Just clear. Clear. Now I can crop out the color chart. And just pretend I'm really good. Okay. Except this is where it doesn't bother focusing, so I'm not going to use it anymore. But you get the idea. Let's go fix another one. Let's try this one. Okay, so let's look at levels here. Again, I'm not changing anything. I just want to see. Is this like a healthy histogram? Meaning, any empty spaces here, and the shadows, any empty spaces in the highlights? No. Do I need to adjust the midpoint? No, it's fine. But if there was a big gap over here, you can prove to yourself that it looks better if you close it by closing it and just observing what happens. If you have the image, the window open in the background behind it. So looking at this one, levels. Got a big gap over here in the whites. So if we open that up, we lose a little texture on the wall. This doesn't need to go to the black point, there's no space here, but I'm going to say, I'm going to align the midpoint with where all that information is. And I can do that by clicking on it and then moving my cursor up to where that info is, and look, it looks more better. And I let go. I'll click OK, and then undo it to prove it to you. So that's after, that's before. That's after, that's before. That's it. Pretty basic stuff, but I would say that's your sort of one-stop shopping for making an image look just a little bit better than what you thought was perfect in the camera, because they can all be a little bit better. So it's correcting the perspective. It's if your lens information is available, why not go ahead and plug it in Lightroom? Just see if it's there. And if it is, yay, it's done some corrections automatically for you. And then Photoshop loves, for sure. Look at that history, because that's going to tell you where you've got some issues and where it could be dialed in a little better. I would avoid the things that most people go straight to, like brightness and contrast. Just don't go there. Don't mess with brightness and contrast. What else? What are the other destructive filters? Image adjustments. Stay away from hue and saturation. Unless you know that you need to change the overall global view of the image. More saturation doesn't make a better image. That's the, most of our undergrads, that's where they go. They go straight to vibrance and brightness and contrast. And it's like, you know, every image has like extra nacho cheese flavor. It's just too much color. You are trying to make a reasonable facsimile of a thing in the world. Right? So you don't need to make the colors look wetter and sexier and more amazing. You want it to look like what you're standing there. And that's essentially what this is. Which is super weird in this context with the work right there. Right? I kind of like that, seeing the image of that exact wall, just a little smaller. Any questions about that stuff? That's a lot of info, right? And Paul and I have time to pack up. See, I told you. So they get If you want these files, I'll put them in our